I've been working in construction for 12 years. Usually it's boring stuff, framing houses in the suburbs or fixing up old kitchens. But last year, I saw an ad on a private forum. Someone needed a contractor for a renovation deep in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. The pay was insane. We're talking triple my usual rate, plus a massive bonus if I finished in 2 weeks. I should have known right then. No one pays that much for a simple porch repair and some interior sanding, unless there was a catch. The drive up was beautiful at first. Then the paved road ended. I spent 2 hours bouncing my truck over dirt paths and overgrown gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, I was in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no neighbors, just miles of dense, dark forest. The cabin itself looked ancient. The wood was gray and weathered. It sat on a raised stone foundation with a wide porch wrapping around the front. The owner, a guy named Miller, met me there. He was thin, pale, and seemed incredibly nervous. He didn't give me a tour. He just handed me the keys, pointed at the porch, and told me to start there. "Don't stay outside after the sun goes down," he said. He didn't say it like a suggestion. He said it like a rule. Then he got in his SUV and drove away, leaving me alone. I started working immediately. I needed to replace some of the floorboards on the porch. They were rotting through. I grabbed my crowbar and started prying up the old wood. That's when I found the first one. Under the porch, in the dark dirt, there was a pile of bones. At first, I thought they were from a bird or maybe a squirrel, but as I cleared more wood, I realized there were hundreds of them, tiny, bleached white bones. And they weren't just tossed there, they were arranged. They were laid out in neat, circular patterns. I felt a chill go down my spine. Maybe it was just a weird animal, I told myself, but these bones didn't have teeth marks on them. They looked clean, almost polished. I worked until about 6 p.m. The sun started to dip behind the peaks, and the woods turned a deep, bruised purple. Remembering what Miller said, I packed up my tools and went inside. The interior of the cabin was cramped. It smelled like old dust and something sweet like rotting fruit. I made some coffee and sat on the small sofa in the living room. It was deathly quiet. In the city, you don't realize how loud silence is. Out there, the silence felt heavy. It felt like it was pressing against the windows. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first sound. Thud. It was a heavy, deliberate step. It came from the porch. I froze. My first thought was a bear. We have black bears in these mountains, and they can be huge. But then I heard another step. Thud. 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 It wasn't the sound of an animal on 4 legs. It was the rhythm of something walking upright. I walked over to the front door. I looked through the small peephole. The porch was empty. The moon was bright enough that I could see the railing and my stacks of lumber. Nothing was there. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't jiggle. It turned slowly and firmly, as if someone was testing to see if it was locked. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. I grabbed my framing hammer from my tool belt. "Who's there?" I shouted. The turning stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was a low, wet, sniffing sound coming from the bottom of the door. Whatever was out there was pressed right up against the wood, smelling the air and the gap under the door. I looked out the window again. Nothing. Not a shadow, not a rustle of the leaves. The heavy footsteps started again. They circled the cabin. Thud, thud, thud. I followed the sound from the inside, moving from the living room to the bedroom, then the kitchen. It stayed right outside the walls. Every few feet it would stop, and I would hear that horrific, deep sniffing. Then came the scratching. It sounded like long, hard niffles dragging across the wood siding. It went all the way around the house, higher than a man could reach. I didn't sleep a second. I sat in the middle of the floor with my hammer and a literal chainsaw I had brought for the job. I waited for the door to burst open, but it never did. When the sun finally came up, the sound stopped. I waited an hour before I dared to open the door. I stepped out onto the porch, my hands shaking. I looked for footprints in the dirt around the cabin. The ground was soft from a light rain the night before. There should have been tracks. There should have been massive boot prints or paw marks. There was nothing. The dirt was undisturbed. I looked at the wood siding where I had heard the scratching. There were no marks. It was as if the sounds had no physical source, but I knew what I heard. I'm a carpenter. I know the sound of weight on wood. Something heavy, something very heavy, had been walking on those boards. I looked down at the gap where I had pulled up the floorboards the day before. The piles of tiny bones were gone. The dirt was flat and empty. I didn't even pack my bags. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my truck, and floored it. I didn't care about the bonus. I didn't care about the tools I left behind. As I was driving down the long, winding path, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Just for a second, I saw something standing in the middle of the road behind me. It was tall, gray, and incredibly thin. It looked like a person, but its arms were way too long, reaching all the way past its knees. It wasn't chasing me. It was just standing there, watching. I never went back. Miller called me a dozen times asking why I quit, but I blocked his number. I don't care how much money is involved. Some places in those mountains don't belong to us, and whatever is living in that cabin is definitely not human. I've been an avid hiker my whole life. I like the isolation. I like the feeling of being the only person for miles. But after what happened last October in the George Washington National Forest, I don't think I can ever go back into the woods again. I was on a solo 3-day trek. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, and a solid 12 miles covered. I set up my camp near a small creek. I had a lightweight tent, a warm sleeping bag, and a small campfire going. The sun went down around 6:30 p.m. I was sitting by the fire, eating some dehydrated beef stew, when I felt that classic eyes on the back of your neck feeling. It's a primal instinct. Your body knows you're being hunted before your brain does. I scanned the tree line with my headlamp. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the white bark of the birch trees. About 50 feet away, I saw 2 glowing eyes. They were amber and bright. I figured it was a deer. They're common in this area, and they're usually pretty bold. I whistled to scare it off. "Hey, get out of here!" I yelled. The eyes didn't move. They stayed perfectly still. I stood up and waved my arms. Usually a deer will bolt the second you make a sudden movement. This thing didn't. Instead, it stepped out from behind a tree. It looked like a buck, a large one, but something was horribly wrong with it. Its neck was too long, almost like a giraffe's neck, and it was twisted at an awkward angle. Its fur was patchy, with huge clumps of skin showing through. And the smell, even from 50 feet away, the wind shifted, and I caught a whiff of it. It smelled like a dumpster in the middle of July, pure, rotting meat. I froze. I've seen sick animals before, but this was different. The deer began to move toward my camp. It didn't walk like a deer. Its legs moved in jerky, snapping motions, like a marionette being pulled by strings. Its joints made loud, popping sounds with every step. Snap, pop, crack. I backed away toward my tent, grabbing my bear spray. "Back off!" I screamed. The creature stopped. It was about 20 feet away now. Then it did the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. It shifted its weight and stood up. It rose onto its back legs, its front hooves limply dangling at its chest. It stood nearly 7 feet tall. It stayed there, balancing perfectly, swaying slightly from side to side. Its face didn't look like a deer anymore. The snout was too short, and the mouth was pulled back into a frozen, toothy grin. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I dived into my tent and zipped it shut. I know a tent is just thin nylon. It won't stop anything. But I needed to hide. I needed to not see that thing anymore. I sat in the dark, clutching my bear spray, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might faint. Outside, it was silent for a long time. Then I heard the snapping of joints again. It was circling my tent. Crunch, snap, crunch. Then the voice started. "Help," it whispered. My blood ran cold. It sounded like a woman. It was a high-pitched, desperate voice coming from right outside the tent flap. "Please, help me. I'm hurt," the voice said. But it wasn't right. The pacing was off. The words were clipped and mechanical, like a recording being played back. There was no emotion behind it, just the raw sound of the words. "Is anyone there? Help me." I stayed silent. I didn't move a muscle. I knew if I spoke, if I acknowledged it, it would be over. This thing was mimicking a human to get me to come out. It wanted me to unzip that door. The voice changed. It started mimicking me. "Hey, get out of here," it shouted. It was my own voice, the exact tone, the exact volume I had used minutes ago. It repeated my words over and over. "Hey, get out of here! Get out of here! Help me! Help me!" It started laughing. It was a distorted, bubbling laugh that sounded like someone gargling water. The scratching started on the top of the tent. I saw the silhouette of a long, thin hoof dragging across the fabric above my head. I took my bear spray and aimed it at the door. I was ready to spray the second that fabric tore. This went on for hours. The voice, the scratching, the smell of rot filling the tent. It was psychological warfare. Around 4 a.m., the sounds finally faded into the distance. I heard the snapping of branches getting further and further away toward the creek. I didn't leave the tent until the sun was fully up. When I finally stepped out, I saw the ground around my tent. The dirt was trampled, but not by hooves. There were marks that looked like human hands had been digging into the soil, dragging the body along. I left all my gear, my tent, my stove, my expensive sleeping bag. I didn't care. I ran. I ran all the way back to the trailhead, nearly 4 hours of sprinting and stumbling. When I got to my car, I didn't stop. I drove straight home. I told a park ranger what I saw, and he just looked at the floor. He didn't act surprised. He just told me to stay out of that section of the forest for a while. I still have nightmares about that voice. Sometimes when I'm at home and it's quiet, I think I hear it outside my window, a high-pitched mechanical whisper asking for help. I don't go outside at night anymore. I keep the curtains closed because I know that thing is still out there, and I know it remembers my voice. I've been working security for 10 years. Most of that time was spent at a quiet suburban mall in Indiana. It was an easy gig. I'd walk the perimeter, check the locks on the department stores, and spend most of my night in the security office watching the monitors. It was boring, and that's exactly how I liked it. But that changed last November. The mall is huge. 3 floors of glass, tile, and empty storefronts. At 3 a.m., the place feels like a tomb. My footsteps on the marble floor sounded like gunshots. I was sitting in the booth, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. Clack, clack, clack. It was coming from the floor right above me. It sounded like someone in hard-soled dress shoes walking across the tile. I looked up at the ceiling. I was the only person with a key to the building. The cleaning crew had left at midnight. I turned my attention to the monitors. I pulled up the cameras for the second-floor north wing. The hallways were empty. The plants were still. Everything looked normal. I was about to write it off as the building settling, but then I saw it. I have a camera pointed directly at a high-end clothing store called Vogue Elite. They had these hyper-realistic mannequins in the front window. They were expensive, made of some kind of high-gloss material that looked almost like real skin. One of them, a male mannequin in a tuxedo, had been positioned looking toward the back of the store during my 1 a.m. rounds. On the screen, that mannequin was now facing the front. Its head was tilted slightly to the side. Its hands, which were supposed to be in its pockets, were now hanging straight down at its sides. My heart did a slow roll in my chest. I zoomed in. The image was grainy, but I could see the reflection of the mall lights on its plastic face. It looked like it was staring right into the camera lens. I told myself a prankster must have broken in. Maybe a teenager stayed behind after closing. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio and headed for the escalator. The mall felt different that night. The air was colder. As I rode the silent escalator up to the second floor, the clack, clack, clack started again. It was faster now. It sounded like someone was running, but the rhythm was wrong. It was too heavy, too mechanical. I reached the top and turned on my heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the dark. I walked toward Vogue Elite. When I got about 20 feet from the storefront, I stopped dead. The mannequin in the tuxedo wasn't in the window anymore. The window display was empty. The stand where it had been bolted down was still there, but the figure was gone. I felt a surge of adrenaline. If someone was stealing these things, they were heavy. They couldn't just run off with them. "Security, I see you!" I shouted. My voice echoed down the long, empty corridor. No one answered. I walked up to the glass door of the store. It was locked from the outside. I pulled out my master key and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't the smell of new clothes. It smelled like old, stagnant water. I shined my light toward the back of the store. There, standing behind a circular rack of coats, was the mannequin. It was facing the wall. Its back was to me. I could see the seams in the plastic shoulders. It was standing perfectly still. "All right, joke's over," I said, my voice shaking. "Come out from behind there." I walked closer. I wanted to see who was moving it. I reached out a hand to grab its shoulder. Just as my fingers were inches away, the mannequin didn't turn around. It snapped. Its head spun 180 degrees, not like a human neck, like a piece of machinery. Its face was now inches from mine. The glass eyes were frozen. Its mouth was sculpted into a slight, arrogant smirk. But it wasn't the face that terrified me. It was the sound. From inside the plastic chest, I heard a wet, rhythmic thumping, like a heart beating inside a hollow shell. I backed away, tripping over a display table. As I fell, I heard the clack, clack, clack. I looked toward the front of the store. 3 other mannequins, 2 women and a child, were standing in the doorway.
They weren't there when I walked in. They were blocking my exit. They weren't moving when I looked at them. They were like statues. But every time I blinked, they were a foot closer. Their poses changed in the split second my eyes were shut. One was now reaching out a stiff plastic hand. The child mannequin was crouched low, like it was about to spring. I didn't think. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the back of the store, toward the emergency exit. I didn't look back, but I could hear them behind me. It sounded like a dozen people in hard shoes sprinting on a hollow floor. Clack, 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 clack. I burst through the heavy steel door and into the service hallway. I ran down the stairs, out the loading dock, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I didn't call my supervisor. I didn't go back for my phone in the security office. I just drove. The next day, they found the mall wide open. My supervisor called me furious. He told me the store was a mess, but when I asked about the mannequins, he got quiet. "They're in the window, Dave," he said. "The store owner says nothing is missing, but he did ask why you moved them all to face the front door." I never went back to pick up my final paycheck. I don't go to malls anymore, and every time I walk past a clothing store in the daylight, I look at the figures in the window. I wait for one of them to blink. I know what's inside them, and I know they're tired of standing still.
I work at a salvage yard in rural Pennsylvania. It's a massive place. Imagine 50 acres of crushed steel, rusted frames, and shattered glass. My job is simple. Stay in the gatehouse, check the perimeter every 2 hours, and make sure no one tries to steal catalytic converters or copper wiring. It's a lonely job. The yard is surrounded by thick woods. At night, the only sounds are the wind whistling through the scrap metal and the occasional owl. Last Tuesday, I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds. I had my heavy mag light in one hand and my radio in the other. I was walking down row 14, a narrow path between walls of stacked, flattened cars. I saw a movement about 50 yards ahead. In the moonlight, I could see a figure. It was thin, wearing what looked like a dark, heavy coat. It was walking slowly across the path, but the way it moved was wrong. It didn't lift its feet, it dragged them. Sh-clunk, sh-clunk. It looked like it was struggling to move its own weight. "Hey, security, identify yourself," I called out. The figure stopped. It didn't turn around. It just stood there, hunched over. I thought it might be a junkie or someone looking for parts, but they usually bolt the second they see a flashlight. This person didn't even flinch. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam hit the figure squarely in the back. The coat was brown and caked in wet black mud. Bits of dead leaves and grass were stuck to the fabric. It looked like the person had been rolling in a swamp. "Turn around, hands where I can see them," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure began to turn. It was a slow, agonizing movement. I heard the sound of wet leather stretching. When it finally faced me, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person, at least not anymore. The face was a pale, sickly gray. The skin was pulled tight over the skull like parchment paper. There were no eyes, just two dark, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light of my flashlight. The mouth was hanging open, and I could see black fluid leaking from the corners of its lips. It smelled like a grave, a mix of wet earth, copper, and something sweet and rotting. I froze.
My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The entity didn't move toward me. It just stood there, staring with those empty sockets. Then it started to make a sound. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a low, rattling wheeze, like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of sand. Ah, ah. I finally found my voice. "Stay back! I have a radio. I'm calling the police." I reached for my radio, but as I looked down at my belt, the walker moved. It didn't run. It moved with a sudden, jerky burst of speed, like a frame was missing from a movie. 1 second, it was 50 feet away. The next, it was 30 feet away. It was still in that same hunched, dragging posture. I didn't wait for a third burst. I turned and sprinted back toward the gatehouse. I could hear it behind me. Shklunk, shklunk, shklunk. The sound was getting louder. It was moving faster than it had any right to. I scrambled into the gatehouse and slammed the heavy metal door. I locked the deadbolt and backed away from the window. I sat on the floor, my chest heaving, listening to the silence outside. Then came the sound on the glass. Ting, ting, ting. It was the sound of a nail file tapping against the window pane. I looked up. The entity was standing right outside. Its face was pressed against the glass. Because there were no eyes, I couldn't tell where it was looking, but I felt its gaze boring into my soul. It stayed there for an hour. It didn't try to break the glass. It didn't try to open the door. It just stood there, tapping and wheezing. When the first light of dawn started to hit the horizon, it simply turned around. It dragged its feet back into the rows of cars and disappeared behind a stack of rusted Fords. I waited until my relief arrived at 7 a.m. I didn't say a word to him. I just handed him the keys and walked to my car. On my way out, I looked at the gatehouse window. There was a smear of black, oily fluid on the glass, and in the mud right outside the door, there were footprints. They weren't footprints from shoes. They were the marks of bare, skeletal feet. And they didn't lead from the woods. They led from a corner of the yard where we keep the cars involved in fatal accidents. I quit that morning. I don't work nights anymore. I don't like the dark, and I definitely don't like the smell of wet earth. Because I know that out there, in some corner of the world, there are things that belong in the ground, and sometimes they get tired of staying there.
I've been working for the city sanitation department for 8 years. Most people think my job is gross, and they aren't wrong. You see the worst of humanity when you're looking through their garbage. But you also find some amazing things. People throw away perfectly good electronics, furniture, and jewelry more often than you'd think. My rule has always been simple. If it's in the bin, it's fair game. I've furnished half my apartment with trash that just needed a little bit of polish. But 3 months ago, I found something that made me realize why some things are thrown away. It was a Tuesday morning, around 4:30 a.m. We were working a route in an older, wealthier part of town. The houses there are big, Victorian-style places with long driveways. At one house, there was a massive pile of junk on the curb. It looked like someone had cleared out an entire attic. There were old clothes, broken chairs, and boxes of dusty books. In the middle of the mess, something caught the light. It was a mirror. It was huge, about 4 feet tall, with a heavy frame made of dark, polished wood. The craftsmanship was incredible. It looked like an antique, something that should have been in a museum, not sitting next to a bag of rotting kitchen scraps. I checked the glass. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't even scratched. It was pristine. I called my partner over, and we lugged it into the back of the truck. I knew I couldn't leave it there. A mirror like that could easily sell for $500, maybe more. When my shift ended, I hauled it up to my second-floor apartment. I placed it in the corner of my living room, right across from the hallway that leads to my bedroom. I cleaned the glass with some Windex, and the mirror looked brand new. It was beautiful, but it had a strange quality to it. The glass seemed deeper than a normal mirror. When I looked at my reflection, it felt like I was looking at a version of myself that was standing a few inches further back than I actually was. That first night, the weirdness started. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I heard a sound. Ting. It was a sharp, clear sound, like someone tapping a fingernail against glass. I sat up and listened. The apartment was quiet. I figured it was just the pipes or the building settling. I closed my eyes again. Ting, ting, ting. It was rhythmic now. I got out of bed and walked into the hallway. The living room was dark, but the moonlight was coming through the window, hitting the mirror. I stood there for a second, looking at it. I couldn't see my reflection clearly in the dark, but the mirror seemed to be glowing with a faint silvery light. I walked over to it. I looked at the glass. There was nothing there, just the dark shapes of my furniture. I went back to bed, feeling a little on edge. The next morning, I woke up and walked into the living room to make coffee. I stopped in my tracks. The mirror wasn't in the corner anymore. It was in the middle of the room, facing the hallway. I lived alone. I knew I hadn't moved it. I'm a big guy, and that mirror was heavy. It took two of us to get it into the truck. There was no way I had sleepwalked and dragged that thing 5 feet across the carpet without waking myself up. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I pushed the mirror back into the corner. I told myself that maybe the floor was slanted, maybe the vibrations from a heavy truck outside had caused it to slide. It sounded like a weak excuse, even to me. That evening, I didn't want to go home. I stayed out late at a bar, then went back around midnight. I kept the lights on. I sat on my couch and stared at the mirror. It sat there, perfectly still. I eventually fell asleep on the couch with the TV on. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of giggling. It was a soft, high-pitched sound. It sounded like a child. I sat up, my heart racing. The TV had gone to a black screen, and the room was silent again. Then I heard a footstep. Stomp. It came from the hallway. I looked toward the mirror. The mirror had moved again. It was now inches away from the couch, angled so it was facing me directly. But I wasn't looking at the frame. I was looking at the reflection. In the reflection, my living room looked different. The furniture was in the same place, but everything was covered in a thick layer of gray dust. And standing right behind the reflection of my couch was a figure. It looked like a woman, but her proportions were all wrong. Her neck was too long, and her head was tilted at a 90-degree angle. She was wearing a tattered white dress. She didn't have a face, just smooth, pale skin where her eyes and mouth should have been. I looked behind me at the actual space behind my couch. Empty. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now. In the reflection, she was reaching out a hand toward the back of my head. I could see her long, gray fingers twitching. I scrambled off the couch and ran for the light switch. I flipped it on, and the room flooded with light. I looked at the mirror. The figure was gone.
The reflection showed my normal, messy living room, but the mirror was still in the middle of the floor. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed a heavy blanket and threw it over the mirror. I didn't want to see the glass anymore. Even under the blanket, I could hear that tapping sound. Ting, ting, ting. It was getting louder, more aggressive. The mirror started to vibrate against the floor. I grabbed my car keys. I didn't even put on shoes. I gripped the sides of the mirror and hauled it out of my apartment. I didn't care about the noise I was making on the stairs. I felt like if I didn't get this thing out of my house right now, I wouldn't live to see the sun. I loaded it into my old pickup truck. I drove straight to the landfill where I work. The gates were locked, but I had my employee key card. I drove all the way to the tipping face, that massive pit where all the city's trash gets dumped and crushed. I backed the truck up to the edge. I grabbed the mirror and I threw it as hard as I could into the dark pit. I heard it smash against a pile of scrap metal. As I stood there, catching my breath, I heard one last thing. Coming from deep inside the pit, under thousands of tons of garbage, I heard that same high-pitched giggle. It sounded disappointed. I drove home and stayed at a friend's place for a week. I eventually moved out of that apartment. I still work for the sanitation department, but I have a new rule now. I don't care how expensive it looks. I don't care if it's a diamond ring or a flat-screen TV. If someone threw it away, there is a reason, and some things are better left in the dark.
I've been a delivery driver for about 2 years. I've seen it all. Weird customers, creepy apartment complexes, and plenty of no-tip orders that make me want to quit. But nothing compares to what happened last October. I was working the late shift on a Friday. It was raining, one of those cold, misty rains that makes the roads look like black glass. Around 11:30 p.m., I got a high-value order from an expensive steakhouse. The tip was already set at $20. The delivery address was about 15 miles outside of the city, deep in the rural outskirts. I usually don't like going that far out at night, but for $20 I figured it was worth it. The drive started fine, but the further I went, the worse the roads got. My GPS eventually told me to turn onto a private dirt road. There were no streetlights. The trees on either side of the road were thick and overgrown, their branches scraping against the roof of my car. "Recalculating," my GPS chirped. I looked at my phone. The blue line on the map was flickering. According to the app, I was driving through a blank spot on the map. There were no house numbers, no landmarks, just a single dot at the end of the road. I kept driving for another 2 miles. Finally, my headlights hit something. It was a house, or it used to be. It was a 2-story farmhouse that had clearly been through a massive fire. The roof was partially collapsed, the siding was charred black, most of the windows were shattered, leaving behind jagged teeth of glass. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But as I got closer, I noticed something impossible. There were lights on inside. They weren't normal lights. They were a bright, artificial white, flickering rapidly like a dying fluorescent bulb. They were coming from the second-floor windows, casting long, jerky shadows against the scorched trees. I stopped the car about 30 feet from the porch. My gut was screaming at me to put the car in reverse and floor it. This had to be a prank or a glitch in the app.
But then I looked at the order instructions on my phone. Please bring the food to the front door. Do not knock. Just wait. I'm an idiot, I know, but I wanted that $20. I grabbed the bag of food, which was still steaming hot, and stepped out into the rain. The air smelled like wet ash and something else, something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. Every step I took toward the house made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt like I was being watched by 100 eyes from those broken windows. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my boots, sounding like it was about to snap. I reached the front door. It was the only part of the house that looked intact. It was a heavy, dark oak door, and it was closed tight. I set the bag of steak and sides down on the porch. I took a photo of it for the app, my hands shaking so much the first 2 shots were blurry. Just as I was about to turn and run, I heard a voice. It came from right behind the door. "Thank you," the voice said. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a computer-generated voice, perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. The syllables were spaced out too evenly. "Leave it on the porch and come inside for a tip." I froze. "That's okay," I said, my voice cracking. "The tip on the app is fine. Have a good night." I started to back away. "No," the voice said. The flatness was gone. Now it sounded wet, like the person speaking had a mouthful of liquid. "Come inside. We are so hungry." The doorknob began to turn. It didn't turn fast. It turned with a slow, agonizing creak. As the door began to open an inch, a smell hit me that nearly made me vomit. It was the smell of rot, deep, ancient rot. It was the smell of a freezer that had been unplugged for a month in the middle of a heat wave. A hand reached around the edge of the door. It wasn't a human hand. It was too long, with at least 5 or 6 knuckles on each finger. The skin was the color of a bruise, a sickly mottled purple and gray. The nails were jagged and yellow, and they scraped against the wood of the door like a knife on a chalkboard. I didn't wait to see the rest. I turned and sprinted for my car. I heard the front door of the house swing wide open. I heard a sound like a heavy, wet sack being dragged across the porch. Slap, drag, slap, drag. I jumped into my car and fumbled with the keys. I looked out the side window. The person was standing on the porch now. In the flickering white light from the upstairs window, I could see it. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, and its body was incredibly thin, like a skeleton wrapped in wet leather. It didn't have a nose or ears. It just had a massive circular hole where its mouth should be, filled with needle-like teeth. It wasn't looking at me. It didn't have eyes. It was tilted its head, as if it was listening to the sound of my engine. I slammed the car into reverse and tore down that dirt road. I didn't care about the suspension. I didn't care about the mud. I just needed to get away from that house. I drove until I hit the main highway. I stopped at a gas station and called the police. I told them I was a delivery driver and that I had stumbled upon a house where someone might be hurt or a squatter was living. The dispatcher was silent for a long time after I gave her the location. "Sir, that road has been closed since 1994. The Miller farmhouse burned down 30 years ago. There's nothing out there but a clearing." I didn't believe her. I went back the next day while the sun was out. I had to know. I found the dirt road. I followed it to the end. There was a clearing. There were some charred foundation stones covered in moss and weeds. But there was no house, no porch, no flickering lights. But right in the middle of the overgrown weeds, exactly where the front door would have been, was the bag of food. It was ripped open, the plastic containers were crushed, the steak was gone, and sitting on top of the torn paper bag was a single dirty coin. It was an old silver dollar from the 1920s. I didn't touch it. I got back in my car and I haven't driven for a delivery app since. I don't care how good the tip is. Some orders aren't meant to be delivered.
I've been a long-haul trucker for 15 years. I've seen every inch of this country. I've seen sunrises over the Atlantic and fog so thick in the Pacific Northwest that you can't see your own hood. But nothing compares to the Nevada desert at 3 in the morning. People call Route 50 the loneliest road in America. It's not just a name, it's a warning. There are stretches where you won't see another set of headlights for 2 hours. It's just you, the hum of the diesel engine, and the infinite black. Last July, I was hauling a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Reno. I was tired. My eyes were burning from the caffeine and the road glare. I was about 50 miles outside of a tiny town called Austin when I saw it. The road was a straight line cutting through the sagebrush. My high beams were cutting a path through the dark. Suddenly, a shape appeared in the middle of the lane. I slammed on the brakes. The air brakes hissed and the tires screamed. I stopped about 20 feet away from it. It was a figure. They were standing perfectly still. They were wrapped in a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket that looked gray in my lights. It covered their head and reached all the way to the asphalt. They looked like a person, but they weren't moving, not even a shiver in the desert wind. I leaned out my window. "Hey, you okay? You need help?" I shouted. No answer. The figure just stood there. I reached for my flashlight and shined it directly at them. The blanket was dirty, stained with what looked like old oil. I climbed down from the cab, grabbing a tire iron just in case. "Sir? Ma'am?" I walked closer. As I got within 10 feet, the figure tilted its head. The blanket slipped back just a few inches. My heart stopped. There was no face. It wasn't just that it was dark, it was smooth. It looked like pale, translucent skin stretched tight over a skull with no eyes, no nose, and no mouth. Just a flat, fleshy surface. I could see the faint pulse of something moving underneath the skin. I didn't say another word. I turned and scrambled back into my truck. I threw it into gear and floored it. I didn't care if I hit the thing. I just needed to be gone. I felt the truck hit a small bump, not like a body, but like a pile of dry sticks. I didn't look back. I drove for 20 minutes at 80 miles an hour. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel straight. I kept checking my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I started to calm down. I told myself it was a hallucination. Sleep deprivation does weird things to the brain. Then my headlights hit something again. Up ahead, in the middle of the road, it was the same figure, the same gray blanket, the same motionless stance. I didn't stop this time. I swerved into the left lane and roared past it.
As I went by, I glanced out the side window. The figure was facing the road, and as I passed, it turned its entire body in one fluid mechanical motion to stay facing the truck. 30 miles later, there it was again. Every time I saw it, it was closer to the center of the road. Every time it felt like the desert was getting smaller. I tried to call the highway patrol, but my phone had no bars. I tried the CB radio, nothing but static. It wasn't the normal white noise of a radio. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy chain across a concrete floor. I was terrified. I was trapped on a road that never ended, being followed by something that didn't have to walk. I decided I wasn't going to look anymore. I stared straight at the white line on the pavement. I pushed the truck as fast as it would go. I saw the figure 4 more times. Each time the blanket looked more tattered. On the last time, the blanket was gone. It was just a thing. It was tall, gray, and its limbs were thin as broomsticks. It was standing on the shoulder, and as I passed, it reached out a long, multi-jointed arm toward my door. I made it to a gas station in Fallon just as the sun was starting to gray the sky. I pulled in and sat there for an hour, crying. I haven't driven the Nevada route since. I took a pay cut to do local runs in California. People ask me why I won't go back. I tell them I'm tired of the desert. But the truth is, I'm afraid that if I go back onto that road, the loop will start again. And I'm afraid that next time, the road won't be long enough for me to get away.
I work as a night manager for a grocery store in a rural part of Virginia. It's a 40-minute drive from my house, mostly through back roads and winding forest paths. I usually leave work around 2 a.m. I've always liked the drive. It's my time to decompress and listen to podcasts. But 2 weeks ago, I learned that being alone on the road is a luxury I took for granted. I was about 10 minutes into my drive. I was on a narrow 2-lane road with a steep drop-off on one side and a rock wall on the other. I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. They were bright, uncomfortably bright. They were the kind of high beams that fill your entire cabin with white light, making it impossible to see the road ahead. I flipped my mirror to the night setting, but the glare was still blinding. The vehicle was an old beat-up van. It looked like an 80s Econoline, rusted and dented. It was right on my bumper. I mean, if I had tapped my brakes, he would have plowed into me. "Asshole," I muttered. I sped up a little, going 10 over the limit. The van stayed right there. It didn't matter how fast I went. If I hit 60, he hit 60. If I slowed down to 40 to see if he would pass, he slowed down too. He was glued to my car. I tried to signal for him to pass. I put on my right blinker and slowed down at a straightaway. He didn't move. He just sat behind me, the high beams vibrating with the engine of the van. That's when the paranoia started to set in. This wasn't just a bad driver. This felt targeted. I decided to try and lose him. I knew these roads better than anyone. There's a sharp S-curve about 5 miles ahead. I waited until the last second, slammed on my brakes, and whipped the car through the turn. I pushed the engine hard, reaching 70 on a road meant for 35. I looked in the mirror. For a second, there was only darkness. I felt a surge of relief. Then the lights flickered back on. The van hadn't just kept up, it had gained on me. It was now so close I could hear the rattling of its loose muffler over my own radio. It felt like the van was an extension of my own car. It moved when I moved. It breathed when I breathed. I started to panic. My heart was thumping in my throat. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen was dead. It was fully charged when I left work, but now it wouldn't even turn on. The radio started acting up, too. The podcast cut out and was replaced by a high-pitched metallic screeching. I saw a 24-hour gas station up ahead. It was a small, brightly lit oasis in the middle of the woods. I didn't even slow down for the turn. I drifted the car into the parking lot and screeched to a halt right in front of the main windows. The van followed me. It pulled into the lot and parked directly behind me, blocking me in. I sat there for a second, my hand on the door handle. I was angry now. I wanted to scream at whoever this was. I wanted to know why they were trying to run me off the road. I grabbed a heavy mag light from my glove box and stepped out of the car. "What is your problem?" I yelled, shielding my eyes from the van's high beams. The van didn't move. The engine was still running, a deep, rhythmic chugging sound that felt like it was vibrating in my teeth. I walked toward the driver's side window. The glass was caked in dirt and grime, but the high beams from the gas station were bright enough to see through. I stopped. The van was empty. I don't mean the driver was hiding. I mean the van was empty. There was no driver's seat. There was no steering wheel. There was no dashboard. The interior of the van was just a hollow, rusted shell of metal. There were no pedals on the floor. There was nothing but a few loose wires hanging from the ceiling. But the engine was roaring. The high beams were burning. I backed away, my stomach turning over. I looked at the front of the van. The grille looked like a row of jagged teeth. The high beams weren't just bulbs, they felt like eyes. I ran into the gas station. The clerk, an old guy named Art, looked up from his newspaper. "Call the police," I shouted. "That van, there's no one in it." Art looked out the window. He looked at the van, then back at me. He looked confused. "What van, son?" I spun around. The parking lot was empty. My car was sitting there alone under the fluorescent lights. There were no tire marks, no smell of exhaust, no sound of a rattling muffler. The van was gone. It was as if it had never existed. I stayed at the gas station until the sun came up. Art thought I was on drugs, but I didn't care. I drove home in the daylight, taking the long way through the main highway. When I got home, I went to wash my car. I wanted to wash the memory of that night away. That's when I saw it. On my rear bumper, there were 2 perfect circles of melted plastic. They were exactly where the high beams of that van would have touched my car. And on my back window, traced in the dust, was a single word: soon. I quit my job the next day. I don't drive at night anymore. I don't even like being in a car after the sun goes down, because every time I hear a sound of a heavy engine or see a pair of bright lights in the distance, I wonder if that empty shell is coming back to finish the drive.